Welcome to the Habitat Podcast, the podcast for wildlife habitat management, hunting strategy, and land stewardship. And now, your host, Jared Van Hees.
Welcome to the Habitat Podcast.
I'm your host, Jared Van Hees, and we are here to become better habitat managers. Guys, we have a smoking new episode for you here today. We have Mr. Thomas Rovery from the University of Tennessee Knoxville, one of Dr. Craig Harper's partners in crime, going over hinge cutting, creating deer bedding, and the proof that it works. Guys, this is an awesome podcast. There's an article in the show notes that the NDA released about 2 weeks ago or so with data showing how hinge cutting does really well. Hinge cutting is a very polarizing term, as you guys all know. We are a fan of it here at the podcast. I've done it for years. I've seen a lot of great examples done. But this is a little bit different even. This is not as big of a mess, which you'll hear in the podcast, which is really cool. And I learned a lot from this podcast. I want to thank Thomas for coming on. It's his first podcast ever, and he did a stand-up job. Really, guys, now is the time to get out there and create that better deer habitat. You'll hear us refer to the benefits of using hinge cutting in this podcast and the facts and science behind it. Now, there are some great visual graphs and statistics in the article. I have some here that I'm going to share as well in the video version of this podcast on our YouTube, the Habitat Podcast on YouTube, so you can get a visual. And this is a video podcast too, so you can go watch Thomas and us have a discussion as well. Like I said, refer to the article, refer to this information here, our video, and this will be a great resource with, again, some new things I learned in this podcast, which is awesome. I love doing this podcast. I love learning. And again, every podcast, I feel like I learned something more. So thanks for tuning in to the Habitat Podcast this week. Be sure to go over and check out NDA, UT, and all the resources that came together on this. I want to thank all of the supporters who got in on the pre-order of the hoodie. That order has now been closed down on the website, and we're off to the printer. Thank you very much to everybody who helped support the podcast and has an awesome new hoodie coming your way soon. Also want to thank everybody who leaves us a great review on Apple iTunes. I am sending out 5-inch Habitat Podcast decals. Shoot me an email, hit me on Instagram with your address if you left a review, and I'll be sure to get one out right away. Guys, without further ado, I want to get right into it. This is an awesome podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let us know how you feel. Give us a 5-star review. We'll be back next week as we become better habitat managers. Have a great weekend.
Hey guys, Al here, Vitalized Seed. I hope you all are doing well. So we got a lot of new things happening at Vitalized this year, and I wanted to highlight some of those. First off, we got a brand new website. We just added a chat feature to that website so you can get your answers to your questions in real time or as fast as possible. Those actually come directly to us so we can answer those questions, as well as has some auto answer features for those frequently asked questions. So trying to further increase the customer service that we offer. Number 2 is we are offering bundles now. So we got a lot of questions about people trying to piecemeal things together. So we took the guesswork out of it for you. You want a fertility bundle? Add that to your cart, and it gives you all of our natural fertility products in one place. We also are adding bulk pricing. So been asked about this in the past, and we've done some, kind of one-off things. But for those people who are buying, 5, 10, 15 acres, depending on the product, we're going to be offering some bulk pricing options for that. So right now we got that up on Nitro Boost. We also are going to have that up for the Clover, Chicory, and Oats offering, and might expand that to other offerings as well. Other things are new products. So we got our annual Clover. That's a fantastic product for frost seeding and also for this early spring, especially for those who still want to plant Nitro Boost. You want to get that annual Clover established, you could go in and drill your Nitro Boost right through it, broadcast through it, mow it off, spray it off, etc. We got our Premium Clover Plus. I'm using that on all my logging trails. That's a fantastic product. I'm also using that often with our Clover, Chicory, and Oats mix. So I might use Clover, Chicory, Oats in the first year on my logging trails like I did last fall. Let those oats come in, they'll die off, and then I can frost seed my Premium Clover and Chicory over top of those trails now. So those are areas where I want a perennial crop growing. So I'm using that mix. And then we added our brassica mix as well. We, of course, have our seed feed and seed armor. Those are selling fantastic, and various other products, guys. So please check us out at vitalizedseed.com. We sure do appreciate you, and we're looking forward to a fantastic 2025.
All right, everybody, we're back. Another episode of the Habitat Podcast. I have my good friend Andy Hutchins on. Andy, how you doing today? Co-hosting with me.
I'm doing well, Jared. How are you doing today, my friend?
Good. Happy Friday. Spring is around the corner, so I'm very excited about that. And we have a special guest today, Mr. Thomas Rovery. Thomas, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. I guess how I got to know who you were, I read an article at the National Deer Association about 3 weeks ago or so. And your name and picture were in there quite a bit. I'm like, I got to get a hold of this guy. So thanks for your time today and for coming on the podcast.
No, I appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to talking today. It should be a lot of fun.
Rock and roll. Well, let's get this started how we always do. Let's hear a little bit about where you're from, your background in maybe hunting or habitat management, how you got into that, and then into your career side of things.
Well, I actually grew up just outside of Memphis, Tennessee, and around Memphis, there's not a lot of opportunities to hunt and fish if you're living in the city. So we would often go out to the Ozark Mountains, or we'd go north to Tipton County, and that's where I did a lot of my work, a lot of management, just really being outside, mostly, not as much hunting, a lot of fishing. But I didn't really get into hunting until I was 15, 16. And then I went to college at Mississippi State University studying wildlife, fisheries, and aquaculture. And that's when I really started studying applied management practices for wildlife, because there were a bunch of opportunities to travel the world and go see different species and study exotic species. But what really interested me is prescribed fire and chemicals and getting a chainsaw out there. And I didn't think that was a real option when I first started Mississippi State. I thought I was going to be a biologist somewhere, but I really fell in love with applied management. And I started my master's degree at UT Knoxville about 2 years ago. And my main project studies the effects of prescribed fire during different seasons on wild turkeys. But we have several different side projects that we work on, and they're all focused on applied management practices, hinge cutting, girdling, mostly with prescribed fire. But this bed and block was one of my favorite side projects to work on. It was passed down from student to student, and my first interview was actually with Dr. Harper when we were applying these treatments. So I was really trying to make a good impression, and he was just out there ripping a chainsaw, and I was using a push pole trying to look my best, and it was a lot of fun.
Well, that's awesome. What was your preferred method on doing that? Like burning or the chemical or the chainsaw? What do you think is, your preferred method there?
My preferred method for any sort of management is burning. I absolutely love doing a prescribed fire, but sometimes it's just really good to get out there with a chainsaw and a squirt bottle and get to work. But most of the time I'm traveling burning. That's what I'm doing.
All right, Thomas. So that's a good background. How is it working with Dr. Craig Harper?
It's a lot of fun. He definitely keeps us busy all the time, and everything we're doing has us on the road or working. We're rarely sitting here in the office. This is Friday's usually my day that I'm sitting in the office working. Every other day I'm outside with a chainsaw or a drip torch.
Okay. That's actually pretty cool. I mean, he was on here episode 45 many years ago, and that's been one of our best episodes, best videos on YouTube. Just the way he explains things in, a professor type manner. Just really easy to grasp. And some of the stuff that I've been following that you're doing recently is also very exciting and easy to grasp for guys like me who've been doing this stuff for a little while here. What's your most popular activity that you do? I know habitat season changes and you do different techniques and applications, but what's your favorite?
That's hard to say because we're usually bouncing around from thing to thing. I think my favorite is the turn right from when we go from our late growing season burns into our dormant season burns, and just watching the difference in intensity of those burns. So our late growing season for my main project ends in October. So that's right at the start of deer season. So I stop burning, have 2 whole months just to work on data, go hunting a little bit and enjoy myself. And then we go back out in January through March for the dormant season to start burning. And the intensity is completely different. So I love having a little bit more of a challenge burning in the late growing season. And then we get to the dormant season and it's a cakewalk. It's so easy, nice to burn.
And why is that?
Well, it's usually there's lower humidity. Things are drier. You might have a little bit more wind. historically, a lot of landowners would just burn in the dormant season and maybe into the early growing season.
Right.
So that's what the main project is focused on is, well, can we increase the burn window and maybe get landowners to burn more in June and July or August through October? Just give them more opportunities to burn instead of just in the dormant season.
Okay. That makes sense to me. I'd like to try a little bit of that this year on a piece that I recently had logged this past fall. And the logging roads where they went and got all the main pole pieces are almost like little fire breaks. So I really think it could work out nice, but I've never done it too seriously. So it should be interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun when you have a good fire break. Makes a world of difference.
Well said. Well said. Well, let's get into the recent article. So I want to kind of just start from the beginning. There's an article on NDA stating about, do bucks use hinge cut bedding areas, bedding blocks, as you guys call them? How did this idea come about? Were you always the one heading up this charge here? Give us the structure, the background on how it started.
So this project and a lot of our other side projects are usually passed from student to student. So I'm collecting data on projects that I may never write up or do anything on. And the students in front of me, Mark Turner, who's now at Oklahoma State University, Jake Bones, working for a private landowner, Spencer Marshall, working for the Rough Grouse Society, they all laid the foundation for all the data that I collected and all the analysis I did. So I'd be remiss to not mention them at all. They did a lot of the heavy lifting. But the idea for the project was that a lot of people know about hinge cutting. A lot of people want to kind of make these bedding blocks on their property, but it's never been investigated. We just assume that it works, and anecdotally we knew it worked, but we didn't know how well it worked. We didn't know why it might have worked. So in 2022, we found, this was before I came on, they found 4 sites, one in northern Pennsylvania, 2 in Tennessee, and 1 in the middle of Mississippi. Found sites that had pretty even distribution of hardwood trees for overstory and a few good mid-story trees that they could hinge cut. And we tried to investigate, does this actually work? So we started cutting in 2023 after taking our baseline vegetation data in September of 2022. And after we implemented the cut, we had cameras placed in 2022 that ran all the way through 2023 and are still running today. But we want to get a baseline of vegetation data and a baseline of how many deer we're seeing in these units before and after we implement the cut. Because we know it works, we've heard it works, but now we can actually get out there and test and provide numbers and figures and statistics to see how it works.
I like that. And you might as well be talking about politics when it comes to hinge cutting within the habitat world, right? I mean, I still talk to different people every day. Some people hate it. Some people love it. There's not many that I talk to that are really, it's a good tool. There's probably a good section of that, but literally people are pretty polarizing on this topic. Was that of any consideration going into this? Should we not dive into this? That's why we should dive into this?
I think that's absolutely why we should dive into this. My understanding when I first started working on the project was that it worked, and my bubble didn't really include people that didn't think it didn't work. So when this article came out and at the meeting it was presented at Deer Study Group, that's when a lot more questions came up about, do you really think this works? Or why are you cutting trees? Or you're just the devil in disguise? Just really very political, very polarizing views that I was not expecting. So I think it's very important to get this data out there to show this works. It's not just some random project that we came up with. This is really an effective management tool that can directly aid our hunters and our landowners.
So at that deer study group, what were their opinions, the general consensus? Was it still polarizing there, or was that more the people in your camp or your bubble where people kind of knew it worked, we just didn't have the hard data yet?
Most everybody at the deer study group enjoyed hinge cutting. They don't think it's a bad idea. They don't think I'm killing the environment by cutting trees and spraying herbicide. There are a few exceptions, and that's usually true for any group.
Sure.
But most of it came out with the NDA article. That's when we started getting a little bit more negative comments and questions that really weren't focused on the project. It was just maybe you shouldn't have done it this way.
Sure. Okay. And I want to get into those at some point. Andy, have you done a lot of hinge cutting in your day?
Yes, we have here on the 50 at home. In fact, we're actually getting ready to do an even bigger hinge cut. Well, as you know, the canopy is pretty grown up in here. Hinge cutting, I always feel like I'm doing it wrong whenever I do it. I always feel like I'm, laying the trees in the wrong spot. Thomas, what would you recommend on that? I guess so. I mean, are you laying down 5-6 trees next to each other? Are you, staggering them? What's the way that you would do it? I guess.
So with this project, we had to do it consistent across all sites, just try and reduce any potential bias. What we would do is we would lay down one tree, and each tree we would cut around 4.5 feet off the ground, around eye level for a deer. So we'd lay one tree down, and then we'd back up and look at all the other small trees in the area and see, well, we can either cut this one down and lay it on top of the first tree we put at an angle, kind of making a V, or we can make a perpendicular angle and put it right on the hinge cut of the first tree we did, so that they're just kind of making a ladder on top of each other. Okay. And what we do is just slowly back up from that starting tree. Sometimes we would make it go around in a circle, but most of the time we were just backing up from that starting tree. And what that does is that puts a little ladder on top of other trees that the deer can walk under, and it leaves a path that the deer can walk through. A lot of hinge cutting and a lot of articles that I've heard of recommend hinge cutting, and it kind of ends up looking like a tornado went through there. There's no real clear path for deer to walk through. There's no clear area that deer would want to bed in. So make those V's, make those ladders. We tried to put it on the hinge cut of other trees as much as possible, just keeping those trees off the ground.
Okay. I like that. I mean, when I have done it in the past, I've, done that, make a mess, and then go in and kind of cut my own path. So I like that, getting that, laying them on top of each other like that. That's great.
Yeah, as long as they have a clear path that you can walk through first, the deer are going to find a path to walk through under the trees.
Okay.
Great question. I think if anybody wants to go back, like Thomas said, we have a lot of podcasts on this topic, how to, which types, etc. But Andy, the going through and clearing afterwards is probably the most important part. Might be as equal as the sunlight part, just to give that navigability through there. So Thomas, back to the study. You guys put cameras out for a year on these properties before you did anything to get a certain set of data. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
And then let's talk about the control versus the operation in each session, in each location or job site, if you will.
Referring to the camera detections?
Oh, yeah. Well, let's do that first. Let's talk about the camera detections first, and then I want to get into kind of what you did at each site.
Okay. Well, we had 4 cameras at each unit, and the units were 5 acres each. So we had a control unit that was 5 acres, and right adjacent to it was the treatment unit that was 5 acres. And 4 cameras in each of these units just to give us an average detection of deer. And before we implemented the cut, the average detections between control and treatment were very, very similar. We had 6 average daily deer detections in the control unit and 5.3 average daily deer detections in the treatment unit. So not statistically different. Pretty much the deer were using the area in the exact same way if it was control or the treatment. They were just walking through. They may have foraged a little bit, but most of the time they were walking through. They were vigilant. Possibly they were looking for predators. So, we also recorded behavior. So we had a better idea of what the deer were doing in each unit, because we can look at a picture and say, well, there's a deer. But if we record the behavior, we can say, here's a deer that's actively foraging in the treatment unit, or here's a deer that's bedding in the control unit. So we can get a better idea of what they're actually doing in these units instead of just raw, here's how many deer we have.
Yeah, it could be hanging out, feeling comfortable, or just passing through and getting the heck out of there, right? So yeah, that's important. And I like how you guys were very serious about the data ahead of time, because that's going to come in towards the end of this when we're comparing the results. So good job on you there. Now let's talk about the treatment areas, the 5 acres. What did you do to those 5 acres? How much of the canopy are we removing? The whole thing.
So for each one, they were almost identical in terms of their species composition and their structure. Very low visual obstruction, very low diversity of species. They, for the most part, they were identical. Control had a little bit more percentage cover of grass, but for the most part, they were identical. So when we went into the treatment unit, what we did is we went in teams of 3 to 4, depending on how many people we had that day. One person running a chainsaw, 2 people on a push pole, which is definitely very important to use as a push pole because it keeps you from cutting through too much of the tree. We cut through about 60% of the actual hinge cut tree and then pushed it over with the hinge cut. And that hopefully resulted in our higher survival rate. And then we had one person who had a spray bottle with a mixture of Garlon and Arsenal and a little bit of a blue dye just so we can easily tell which trees we've marked and which trees we should have killed. So the person with the chainsaw would start cutting trees. The push pole team would push it over. And while they're doing that, the chainsaw would run over to another tree. Anything greater than 10 inches DBH is usually the standard for hinge cutting trees. If it's over 10 inches, you don't hinge cut it, you girdle it. If it's less than 10 inches, you can hinge cut it safely. But they would run over to the overstory trees that were greater than 10 inches, ring those, while the spray bottle would come behind and start spraying them. So we tried to leave as many overstory species as we could. If they were mass-producing trees or they were really good for wildlife, we wouldn't touch them. We would just remove any trees around those mass-producing trees and try and keep the canopy from touching. We were aiming for at least 50% sunlight, and this treatment does not work if you don't have sunlight, and I think that's true for any bedding block. So at least 50% sunlight. Try and remove the crown competition from your dominant mass-producing trees. Kill any undesirable species that are not good for wildlife. Your tulip poplars, just get rid of them. Your sweet gums, if they are mature, don't offer much wildlife value, especially for deer. Get rid of them. But your hinge cut trees, you want to push over trees that can bend pretty easily. And in fact, I think yesterday there was an article from NDA where Dr. Harper discussed which trees would be good to hinge cut, which trees would be good just to stump, sprout, and spray. So we went for more hickories, we went for oaks, we went for sweet gums, anything that we could bend over, and we knew that it would survive. That's what we tried to hinge cut. If it was a species that was smaller than 10 inches DBH that likely wasn't going to survive the hinge cut treatment, we would either hack and squirt or we would just cut it down and leave it on the ground. This was some of your black cherries. We did hinge cut some maples. We did just completely remove other maples. So it really is up to your discretion what species you want to cut and which species you want to leave. And that guide is very, very helpful for if I should hinge cut this tree, if it's going to come back, if it's going to resprout and going to provide extra cover or potentially very nutritious young stems for wildlife. So I highly recommend that article. But the big things we were going for was 50% sunlight, remove crown competition from your dominant mass-producing trees, and get down as hinge cut as many trees as possible. That was our main objective.
I like that. And why the 50% mark? And was that enough looking back?
It's
for the canopy opening.
No, yes, sir. It is difficult sometimes to get greater than 50% at some stands. For our Mississippi site, it was very, very dense. We had to cut and girdle a lot of trees. But for other sites, like at Buffalo Ridge WMA or our site up in Pennsylvania, the basal area was already pretty low. So if we cut too many trees, it would just turn it into a savanna. We still want it to be more of a forested area. So that 50% is a really good measure to try and get to. It keeps you from turning into an open field. It provides more cover. You can have your dominant trees still producing and dropping acorns as much as they can. But 50% is usually the minimum when it comes to enough sunlight for your bedding blocks. That would be the minimum. Anything greater would work, but you don't want to cut down every single tree you have out there.
No, thanks for that. I learned something there. I think, like you said, the minimum is key, but that's a good tip for somebody who's going out there and trying this to at least try to get 50. You might think you have 50 and it's probably harder to get to than most people think. I think a lot of hinge cutting isn't successful, like you mentioned, because there's still shade up there. And for a hinge cut to live, it has to have sunlight.
There are several times where we've measured sunlight and we just looking at the stand, it looks like it's going to be 75% sunlight, 80% sunlight, and it's barely 13%.
Wow.
So you really want to make sure you can cut as many trees as you can and produce and get as much sunlight into the understory as you can.
Another question, how do you measure the sunlight and the canopy to know how much reduction you've completed?
There are different methods, and there are methods that are definitely more economically feasible than this. But we have septometers, which are pretty much 3-foot-long poles attached to a computer that measure the active photosynthetically active radiation, which essentially just means sunlight. How much sunlight is in a given area. And we'll walk a straight line through the transect, and we want to know how much sunlight we're getting over the course of that time. So we'll walk 2 feet, stop, take a measurement, walk another 2 feet, stop, take a measurement. And at the same time we're taking that measurement, there's another septometer on the outside that's not in any obstruction. It's in 100% sunlight. So we can measure the difference between those two measurements and see what the percent sunlight is in the canopy. I'm sure you can find plenty of articles online because these septometers are very expensive. We bought them for the project, and I don't think just your everyday landowner is going to want to buy 2 of these.
Yeah, I've never used one. That's pretty interesting. It's actually kind of staggering the fact that you said you think you have 70, 80 and it's only 13. Was there any direction? You did the whole block, these 5-acre blocks. Was there any direction that you fell these trees in terms of a southern facing sunlight or anything like that have anything to do with it, or was that maybe not as measurable?
We, from what I recall, we didn't cut in any specific direction. If you do cut in all in one direction or all in a similar direction, you have a harder time creating those paths for deer to walk through. That's what really looks like a tornado is everything's blown over in the exact same direction, and deer may not want to walk through those rows. So we would pick out the best direction to fell the tree based on where, if it was going to fall, was it going to get caught in another tree, and then we were going to have to cut that tree, and then we've got 3 or 4 trees all tied together that are about to fall on top of somebody. So our main goal was to cut in the easiest path to fell the tree first. And then once that starts opening up, you can cut in any direction you want to, as long as it's going back towards that original tree or until another tree that you just started a new hinge cut on. So make sure that you're doing it safely and make sure that you're cutting it in a direction that you're not going to get it stuck. And now you've just got a tree hanging out that's not going to do anything. It's not going to provide any obstruction.
Right.
So saying so if you hinge cut one tree, that's not enough to do really anything then?
No, we were cutting several dozens of trees in each little block in the treatment unit. You cannot do 10 trees and expect to see a great result. This is 5 acres of hinge cut trees. This could be hundreds of trees that we've cut. It could be 75. It could be 120. So really make sure that you're cutting that entire block. 1 tree, 10 trees is really not going to make a difference. They may find that area and they may want to bed in that area, but the larger your bedding block is, the more likely you are to see the results that we saw, and the more likely you are to actually have deer bed in those areas consistently.
Okay, so don't be afraid to get out there and cut.
No, please just start cutting. Do it safely, but start cutting.
Amen.
So how long did it take with the whole treatment process on for deer to get back on camera after you guys were in there?
Well, we cut in February and March of 2023, and we saw a dramatic increase in the detections of deer immediately after we applied those cuts. Sometimes it was just the night after we cut that we started seeing deer use that area and start bedding in that area. Sometimes it was 1 to 2 days. But if you look at the actual detections of deer that we saw, they were going down in January in both treatments. So in control and treatment, the average daily deer detections were decreasing. There weren't that many deer using the area. But in February and March, immediately after we applied the cut, we saw a 435% increase in the average daily deer detections. So it immediately shot up in terms of use. The control stayed the same. control just did not have much use. But immediately after we applied the cut, there was a massive increase in deer detections in these units.
Okay, that's awesome.
435%. Holy wow.
That's a good number right there.
Yeah, that when the results came back for that one, I was a little surprised. I had to redo that a couple times just to make sure.
This podcast is brought to you by Latitude Outdoors. Guys, Latitude Outdoors is one of the top saddle hunting manufacturing companies in the world, here headquartered in Michigan. Guys, I've worked with Kevin, Alex, the guys over there at Latitude. I've been using their products for over 3 seasons here at Habitat Podcast. The first deer I shot was that first big buck on the 15 acres out of my Method 2 saddle. That buck, I shot him out of the saddle using the climbing sticks, the platform, everything to get up, and that saddle is very versatile when selecting a tree. It's the first time I hunted that tree on the 15 acres. I climbed up that day and was able to make the shot and a follow-up shot on that buck in that saddle. Guys, the saddle is so easy to use. You literally strap it on like a seat belt, like a belt. It's all ropes. There's no metal components. There's no chinging and banging and clunking. I wrap it around, I step into it, I cinch it down, and I'm on my way out. I also use their Carbon Speed Series climbing sticks. I got those brand new this year. I've been using those all over bow hunting and gun hunting, from public land to private. Very lightweight, easy to carry, stackable sticks. I ended up putting cell strips on mine and using daisy chains. They compact very well, hang out of the bottom of my pack. When I'm wearing the Method 2 saddle, I can easily pick any tree in the woods and hunt. Guys, if you're looking for a way to outfit your property without spending $200 per stand, like I'm gonna do on the new 40, I'm gonna prep a bunch of saddle trees and keep the deer guessing on where I'm sitting. They will not know my true stand location because I will not have one. Guys, saddles are very versatile. I urge you to check them out. Latitude Outdoors. Again, I've been using them for years and they are great products. Latitude Outdoors, thank you for supporting the Habitat Podcast. Have you guys used a Packer Max Cultipacker yet? I know that being the first partner of the Habitat Podcast, I've been using one for over 5 years now. Guys, cultipacking is one of the highest rated and highly overlooked part of your food plot system. It helps maintain soil moisture, keeps it in the soil, improves seed to soil contact when you press those seeds into the dirt, and ensures superior seed germination for all seed types. I do not plant a food plot without cultipacking. Guys, Packer Max and Lincoln over there, great company, great people. They have 5 different cultipackers available at packermax.com, and they also have a roller crimper combo attachment for the Packer Max. So that's what I use. I can crimp, I can pack, I can do everything with my Packer Max crimper combo. They even came out with a 6-foot unit at packermax.com. Guys, be sure to utilize this piece of equipment when you're planting food plots to get the best success in your seed germination. Check them out, packermax.com. We have a code HPC25 at checkout to save money. Yeah, that's probably the result, right? So
Absolutely. What about the Predator? I read in the article the Predator count had gone down with the hinge cutting.
Yes. So we looked at it at different times of the year. Throughout the whole year, predator detections in the control increased about 15 to 20%. But in the treatment unit, predator detections decreased about 25%. And that's just an average for the whole year.
Okay.
For that specific presentation, I really wanted to look at coyotes and bobcats during fawning season, because that's the time that they pose the biggest threat to a deer. Is when your fawns are new on the ground, they're very, very young. That's the time that they pose the biggest threat. So the control had a 21% increase in predator detections, coyote and bobcat, but they had a 41% decrease in the treatment unit. So they're not using these hinge cut areas, and there's greater visual obstruction. So more does and more fawns are using this area, and there's less predators in the hinge cut treatment. Now, we did have some black bears at the Pennsylvania site, and there was a slight increase in the treatment unit with black bears, but not enough to make me worry. It's to be expected they might use that area a little bit more, just a little bit more cover. But just for bobcats and coyotes, which is important for most landowners across the United States, you do see a reduction in your detection of predators.
Okay. Yeah, I would have thought exactly the exact opposite there by opening that up and putting more deer, 400 and some percent more activity in there. And then I would have figured the predator would have went up, but going down, that's very appetizing right there.
We think part of it is just the size of the bedding block. So if your bedding block's too small, your predator's going to walk right next to it, notice that deer, and then jump in and get it. But with 5 acres, you have a little bit more leeway that the predator's going to walk along the edge of that bedding block, and it may not detect that there's any deer actually in there. They probably smell them, but they might not want to go into that treatment unit. So I was very, very happy with the predator results.
Yeah, that's great.
That's like icing on the cake there. I mean, that's like a myth, Andy, or not a myth. I mean, if you increase the habitat in an area, you're going to draw in more game. I've seen coyotes hang around, but if they've been smaller than 5-acre areas. So that's super interesting. And the black bear, one more question on the black bear. They like to travel and cover more. So do you think there's any relation to more fawning? Because black bears are one of the biggest predators when it comes to fawns. Is there any relation there, or we just don't know yet?
We really don't know. We had a total of 50 black bear detections, so that's not really enough to make a good, educated guess about it. We're still collecting data, and we're going to see if the number of any species changes over time. But just in general, we saw a slight increase in black bears, and most of that increase occurred during the winter, not when there are a bunch of fawns running around.
Okay. Let's talk about some more of your results. Like you mentioned in the pre-treatment gathering of information, they were very identical, for the most part, maybe some more grass in the control area than the treatment, and one, it looks like 1 or 2 areas. Post-treatment, what are we looking at in terms of the treatment versus the control area after we've done the treatment between the forbs, grasses, woody browse, etc.?
So what we're seeing is the effect of that 50% sunlight. Without that sunlight, this just would not work. You'd cut your trees, you'd have more visual obstruction, but there wouldn't be much else drawing a deer in besides visual obstruction. So these were recorded in September, just right at the end of the growing season around all of our sites. And you can see that we had an increase in forbs, we had an increase in semi-woody plants, which is your brambles, your shrubs, and we had an increase in woody plants. So all the sunlight is now reaching the forest floor and stimulating more growth in the treatment unit than there is in the control unit. There's no change in the percent coverage of the control unit, really. Everything there is negligible, but we see dramatic increases in forbs and woody plants. So that sunlight is reaching the forest floor and it's stimulating growth. And now, in addition to bedding, there are some species that deer really enjoy eating, and they're growing more in these treatment units. So we're providing cover, but also during the summer and late in the growing season, we're providing a lot of highly nutritious forage for these deer to use.
Yeah, that's pretty popular. People might know that with the sunlight, but I mean, when you're putting that right next to maybe your neighbor who has never done this, and his woods look like the control and yours look like the treatment, I mean, that's huge. That's huge. And you also mentioned the fawning season, there was a larger increase of deer use, 146% based on this graph I'm looking at. But even in hunting season, there was almost an 80% increase. And that's why a lot of us do this too, is for hunting. So it was not just one or the other. You're getting the best of both worlds with this.
Absolutely. This is an investment for your deer for the entire year. But as you said, most people are going to use this right around hunting season. That's when it's very important to know, here's where deer might be on my property. Here's where they might be going, traveling to, moving from. So we had a near 80% increase during hunting season. And we think that it's a little bit lower than during fawning season just because there's not as much food available. The cover's still great, but deer are moving around more because of the rut. So they're not staying in one area as long, but they are still bedding in these blocks consistently. And we still see that increase in the total number of deer detections. So that your benefit is for the entire year. But if you're doing this just to hunt, you're still having an incredible increase in your deer detections when it really matters to you.
That's great. Were any of these treatment any of the areas, near any other bedding or cover that could influence this, like a swamp next to it, or anything else where there's maybe equal bedding habitat next door? Or were these all very monotonous woody areas, kind of easier, probably a better control that way? You know what I'm trying to say? Any outside influences that could have affected any of this?
No, they were all very homogenous around the area. We didn't want there to be, a food plot right next door, and then they're moving to the food plot, and then they move into our bedding block. We don't want that to bias our data at all. The only consistent landmark around each of the bedding blocks was a road that we used to access. So it's possible they walked along that edge and then saw the bedding block, but the surrounding area around each of our treatments and control was very homogeneous.
Okay. Now, the survival rate of the hinge cuts and the girdle trees, let's talk about that. A lot of people don't think hinge cuts are going to live. Again, we covered that already with there's usually not enough sunlight left for them. What did you guys find with your 50% number on survival rates of the trees that you took out and hinged, girdling and hinge?
So when you have that sunlight and when you cut trees that respond well to hinge cutting, we had 70, let me get the exact number. Yeah, 72% of all of our hinge cut trees survived the treatment. So that number's pretty astounding in terms of over half that tree's been cut and it's now laying on the ground. So those hinge cut trees, 72% of them are now providing visual obstruction, and they're kind of resprouting from the stump or just leafing out during the growing season. So that increases your visual obstruction even further. It can provide some highly nutritious young stems that some deer sometimes like to use. But that combination of sunlight and cutting those desired species really increases your survival, and it honestly makes the benefit of hinge cutting tenfold. Because if you're just cutting and the tree dies, yeah, you've got visual obstruction, but that tree's just going to rot away and fall on the ground, and then you got to go and clean it up more. That 72% survival really keeps your stand alive and lets you do more management with it later on down the road. What we can do is 1 to 2 years after that treatment, those stems are now resprouting from the hinge cut tree, and we can actually hinge cut those same stems. So we're hinge cutting an already hinge cut tree, and we're increasing that visual obstruction, making things a little bit cleaner. Maybe you want to change how the layout is. So that 72% survival is very, very helpful for you 2, 5, 10 years down the road. Without that survival, you're not going to see much benefit. But with in regards to girdling, we had 97% died, which is exactly what we wanted to see. We think that the very low percent that actually survived, we just didn't cut deep enough. They were some of our largest trees in terms of circumference. So we think we just didn't cut deep enough, or we may have missed. We didn't spray enough inside the cut. So it's as close to 100% mortality with your hinge cut, your girdle treatment that you could possibly get. So you are absolutely going to increase your sunlight if you apply that Garlon and Arsenal treatment, and if you cut it deep enough. That's what we really wanted to see. Is we wanted to kill those trees we wanted to kill, and we wanted the hinge cut trees to survive as much as possible.
And I would even go a little further and add, like you mentioned with Dr. Harper's article that came out yesterday or whatever, you guys are targeting specific species for this. So if somebody goes in there and hinge cuts a cherry and it doesn't live, that's not exactly what we're doing here, right? So you're getting a better survival rate because of your selection of species that you're girdling and or hinge cutting.
Exactly. You can hinge cut a cherry and it might survive, but if you hinge cut a hickory, or if you hinge cut maybe a maple, maybe some oaks, they're more likely to survive, and they're more likely to give you benefit for the next decade.
Yep. I remember on my first property, I hinge cut a large aspen, and it was probably 14 inches around. And I was very proud that I actually made the hinge and it stayed together. It died, right? Because it's just not one of those species that we're talking about here. Those are better being flush cut, and then all the shoots come off from those. But I see what you're saying and how those numbers could be severely affected if you just go in there and cut everything. Are you guys running any fire through any of this in the future, or would that be kind of turning us the opposite direction with some of the obstruction cover?
Now, like I said, I love fire. It's one of my favorite things to do with these projects. But this is the one time that I would not recommend a prescribed fire. You're more than likely going to kill your hinge cut trees with their exposed they're exposed at the hinge cut. You're going to remove most of your visual obstruction. It's really best just to make sure that you spray any invasive species you might have and just keep the hinge cuts clean. Make sure that there are still paths to go through. But I would not recommend a prescribed fire. You're really going to reduce the benefit that you see.
Okay, and then if you again, just hypothetically, if you had a wood lot, like you're trying to create an oak savanna and you run some fire through there, and then you do what we're talking about today, a hinge cut lot right next to it, just very high level, very quickly, which one do you think would be more beneficial?
It depends on what you're looking for. If you're wanting to predict deer, you're wanting to hold deer on your property, that bedding block might be more useful. But over time, those repeated fires, that's going to stimulate more growth. Especially during different seasons is what we're studying. But you're going to see more growth of forage species for deer to use in those burned woodlots. So I would say, why not both? Why not have an area that your deer can bed in, and then right next to it, an area that they can go have a buffet in? It's really just make sure that you are managing for your desired outcome. If you want a bed, make a bedding block. If you want them to eat, set a fire through there.
Yeah, that's a great response. It always comes back to the goals. And I mean, hypothetically, I think that, or from what I've seen in Michigan, our deer are so pressured and crazy that I think you want to have the bedding blocks first. I mean, you could have the fire and the food, but when and the forbs and herbaceous growth, but when that comes October, November, and the woods have been hunted for 6 weeks, that bedding block I think might take over in terms of sightings. Hard to say, but we need that here with the crazy pressure we have.
So, one of the things that I tell my father-in-law a lot is he worries so much. He won't do quality deer management. He wants to leave those young bucks and he wants to let them grow, but he's so nervous that all of the neighbors are just going to shoot it tomorrow. And he might as well just take it now and then get it. And that way nobody else can steal it from him next year or in the next few days. Well, why don't you make your property the hub of deer in the area? If you make your property very desirable for deer, sure, your neighbors may still take the deer that you want, and they may not leave it to grow as much as it possibly could, but you have a much greater chance of supporting your deer and making sure the deer that you want are staying around your property. That's the direct management tool that this hinge cut project provides, this bed and block project provides. This is now a tool that landowners can use, that managers can use, and that just normal hunters can use. You can predict deer movement on your property, you can hold deer more on your property, and you can attract deer and make sure they're staying around the areas where you want them to stay. So I can't guarantee that your neighbor won't shoot the buck you want, but you have a much better chance of that buck surviving if it stays around your property.
Thomas, I think you and I have the same father-in-law. I'm pretty sure.
I'm pretty sure we all do.
Back to the species of trees. Now I'm heavily mapled. What would you do for a hinge cutting bedding area when you're, more maple than anything?
Yeah, maple doesn't always respond well to a hinge cut. It can. What we did that increased our success with maples is we didn't cut through as much of the tree. We would do 50%, maybe 40%. And we would choose smaller trees, even much smaller than 10 inches DBH, because a 10-inch tree is pretty difficult to push down, even if you've cut through 60% of it. But if you reduce the cut in that maple and you push it over with that habitat hook or a push pole, it's more likely going to survive. Now, you can't apply this treatment everywhere. Some places don't have enough mid-story trees. Some people have way too much overstory tree to even get that 50% sunlight. But if you do have a lot of undesirable hinge cut species like maple, maybe just reduce the cut a little bit and try and leave as much intact and try and increase your sunlight so that it's more likely to survive.
I appreciate that.
That's a great question, Andy. In northern Michigan, we have a lot of maple, so
We do.
I understand that. One thing that I noticed that kind of surprised me with your results and the pictures you sent and that are in the article, it's with the way you did girdling for the larger trees with the 10 or 14-inch GBH and above. You don't have the quote unquote mess like you mentioned that I've made on my own properties or that I've seen on properties. It made me think it wasn't enough cutting and like why are these bigger trees still standing, but they're girdled. I mean, we all know how much time it takes to cut up and buck out a 14-inch maple tree. You're spending half the day doing that.
Mhm.
So that was a very cool surprise that I think I'm seeing with the results here.
No, girdling is one of the easiest, simplest methods you can do, and you see outstanding results with it. One of the problems that some people had was that, well, your project only is benefiting deer, or your project is only benefiting hunters, and that's not true. When you hinge cut or girdle these trees just turn into snags, and you have bats roost in there. You can have squirrels use them. You have several songbirds use them. So you've reduced the amount of light, or you've increased the amount of light that that is reaching the forest floor, and you're benefiting your deer that way with the stimulation of understory species. But you're benefiting way more than just deer. It's safer. You don't have to spend as much time cutting on it, and you leave those trees up for several years, and it provides benefit to many, many, many other species. So I highly recommend girdling as much as possible, opposed to just cutting and leaving.
And what would you say to anybody who might have the cliche question of, well, that tree's gonna fall on me sometime?
Well, it's going to fall at some point, but it could stay standing for 50 years. You don't know when that tree is going to fall. It's better just to girdle it and then come back every 1 to 2 years, because your chance, if you come back every 1 to 2 years, of that tree falling on you is negligible. But if you cut that tree, the chance of that tree actually falling on you while you're cutting it, or hurting somebody else, or destroying the hinge cuts you have made around it, it increases so much that it's just not recommended. It's not a good idea. It's better just to girdle it and leave it. That way you're saving yourself, you're saving your time, you're saving your life, essentially.
I love it. And if you do need that tree to fall down, you want to make that mess to maybe lay some of your hinge cuts on top of, traditional felling technique works great for that too, right? A lot safer.
Yeah, you can fell it if you want to. It's just a matter of, I think girdling's a whole lot easier.
I would agree.
What about doing hinge cuts on like terrain features? Hills. If let's say your property is more hilly than flat, what do you recommend there?
We 2 of our sites were very hilly, the 2 Tennessee sites. So what we usually did was we would match the contour of the slope, and we try and do it perpendicular as much as possible. But then again, you run the risk of making those lanes that deer are gonna not want to walk through. So keep that same layout of 1 tree down, lay on top of other trees, but make sure you try and keep it just evenly distributed. Do the contour of the slope, maybe have a few going up slope, maybe have a few going down slope. But the most important thing is just leave that path through there. If you hinge cut up the slope, you're maybe going to see more visual obstruction than you would if it was hinge cut down the slope, but you're definitely going to see more visual obstruction if it's perpendicular to your slope. But keep it balanced, make sure you're still leaving paths and it's not just all in one direction.
Great advice.
And just to clarify real quick, when you were seeing all this 400% increase in detection right after the cut, and then the increase in all the great vegetation, that was the same growing year you cut in 23?
No, that was 1 growing season after in
Great.
2024. So we do have measurements for 2023, but we had an issue with the data where it got sent to Oklahoma and it got sent to Pennsylvania and sent all the way around. So I just wasn't comfortable using it for this analysis because it was missing a good amount of data. So we resampled in 2024, and that's just 1 growing season afterwards. We can really tell, here's what happens after you increase that sunlight and you leave it for time give it time to grow.
I was just gonna say, I think the forest takes a little bit more time to grow and show that vegetation coming back. Do you think there was a lot of growth in the first year? I know there's more in the second year, but was there a good increase year one from the response?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
It was a similar result to what we saw in September 2024 compared to September 2023.
Okay.
It was a similar increase, but after 2023, going into 2024, that increase was much greater.
Awesome. One more question. Well, maybe more than one, but like I said, I was surprised at the lack of a mess, which is really cool. Were there any other surprises that we haven't covered today that you guys uncovered in this study?
Most of the surprises we've covered. The survival of hinge-cut trees. We weren't surprised by the mortality of girdled trees. That was expected. But really, the survival of predators, or the detections of predators, that was definitely the most surprising to me. I just did not expect that to happen at all. We're seeing an increase in your deer detections, and at the same time, we're seeing a decrease in your predator detections. That's unheard of in terms of management tools. Usually, you're increasing your deer, you're increasing your turkey, and that's pretty good for your mesomammals. That's pretty good for your coyotes or your bobcats. But this is one of those studies that I was blown away that we have predators decreasing, and at the same time, your deer are increasing.
As well as their security cover, their food, their stress levels are going down. You guys knocked it out of the park.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And I'm really excited to write this up and get it published here sometime very soon.
Yeah, I'd like to do a follow-up with you too in a year or so and see if you guys have learned anything else and maybe relook at the numbers. They're staggering. And I think that if anybody wanted to reach out in the meantime, before I hit you with the rapid fire questions, is there any place they can get a hold of you, or should we just refer to the articles and the info, or what are your thoughts there?
Definitely refer to the articles. I have a school email that's trovery, TROVERY, at vols.utk.edu. I try and respond as much as I can, but like I said, I'm usually on the road. It's very difficult to respond to emails when you're driving. So, but I'm happy to take any questions or other information about the project, but definitely refer to those articles, because that's pretty much all the information we shared was everything that the NDA stated.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think it was pretty cool. Last night I'm Facebooking you at like 11 at night, and you're like, "Oh, we just got done, still working, heading back." So it's you're not kidding when you're saying you're out there doing stuff all the time.
No, we were burning south of Meridian yesterday, burning south of Tuscaloosa Wednesday, burning north of Knoxville Tuesday, and then I'll be back to South Carolina start of next week.
Wow, awesome. Andy, anything else from you before I hit him with a rapid fire, and we'll let Thomas get back to his busy day here?
No, I think we're ready for that rapid fire.
All right, Thomas. These aren't anything too insane, really, but it's kind of a fun deal we do here. Your favorite beverage?
Root beer, absolutely. I get a lot of flack for it. I don't know why. It has no caffeine, and it's just really, really good.
Love it, love it. Favorite venison or wild game recipe? What's your go-to?
Ooh, I've started. Most people, just put the shoulder in the crock pot and they just let it stew. I've started combining that just with more kind of spicy ingredients, peppercini peppers, bell peppers, and almost making kind of like a near chorizo with your deer shoulder.
Yes,
and
sir.
I've had varying success on it. Sometimes it's way too hot. Sometimes it just tastes like a normal shoulder. But if you get it right, it's surprisingly good.
I love every part of that.
Yeah, that sounds delicious.
Are you a bow hunter?
I'm not a bow hunter. I'm trying to get into it this year, but it's very expensive to get into it.
Okay, so what's your go-to hunting technique?
Usually, start muzzleloader season just up in a tree stand. I usually only hunt in the mornings. Usually working the rest of the day. Don't have time to get out in the afternoon. But gun and muzzleloader season, you cannot beat just a normal tree stand. Father-in-law loves box stands. He loves to put his heater in there. He loves to have a little grill with his breakfast in there. And that's not always hunting to me. Sometimes you really just need to be out sitting on a tree.
Sure. What is your choice of weapon then? What caliber, what make, what model?
I actually use my grandfather's 30-06, Remington 30-06. So I've used that for several years. I have other rifles, but that's just the one that I love to use the most.
Love the same camp. I use my grandpa's 7 mag. So I have plenty of guns, but that's the one. You kind of answered with what do you do most? Preset stands, blinds are going mobile, so we'll skip that. Here's one. Food, water, or cover for white-tailed deer, you can only pick one.
The best answer is it depends. But most research today, you're really looking at, and at least what most research today focuses on, is the food. You can have cover for deer, but if they don't have anything to eat, they'll just bed and starve. You can have water, but a lot of the water they get from their food. So food is very, very important for white-tailed deer.
I think I should add as a fourth choice, our study we talked about today, hinge-cut bedding blocks, because you get the best of cover and food there.
Well, absolutely. I'd recommend this, but definitely the most important, if you have to make a choice, is provide that food for your deer.
Awesome. Your favorite habitat tool or implement?
Is a chainsaw too simple?
Nope.
Or is a drip torch too simple?
No.
No, you really can't beat a good chainsaw when it's working well, you've taken care of it, and you definitely can't beat a great drip torch. That just makes everything so much easier, and it's a whole lot of fun to use.
Awesome. What saw do you run normally?
We just use steel, I think 1700.
Yep. And your favorite tree, last but not least. We get a bunch of surprising answers on this. Could be used for hunting, could be habitat use, you like to plant them, could be just like seeing it driving down the road. What's your favorite tree? That's the last question.
I'm working on a house out in West Tennessee right now, and it's very difficult building a house. It's not fun. But we've got this massive pignut hickory in the backyard. And it's probably the biggest pignut hickory I've ever seen. It's probably not my favorite species, but it's definitely my favorite tree, because I'm just imagining putting a fence in the backyard, having that tree right out in the middle of the yard, put a table under it, and just have friends over all the time. It's a really, really beautiful hickory.
Well, I don't think anybody else has picked pignut hickory before, so that's why I like this question. We hear some new stuff all the time. Well, Thomas, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and getting on here as quick as you did. A great work in the field. I appreciate that. We all appreciate that. And I'm sure this podcast is going to be a raging success. Anything you want to leave us with before we let you go?
I feel like I have to say it. If you have experience with a chainsaw, or if you don't have experience with a chainsaw, just be safe. Make sure you're being safe first and foremost. A lot of guys get out there, they get excited, they just want to go cut stuff. It's better to be alive than it is to have a bunch of deer on your property. So just be careful, make sure you know what you're doing, make sure you don't go over that 10 inches DBH. That's the last thing I recommend. But above that, make sure you're actually implementing for wildlife. Make sure you're having a good time. Make sure you're wanting to have that deer use increase on your property.
Well said, buddy. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Love it.
Well, thank y'all both very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the Habitat Podcast. We really do appreciate you guys coming back every week to get this awesome Habitat content. And we would appreciate it if you went to iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to this podcast, and leave us a 5-star review. That helps us continue to grow and trend in the right direction, attract new listeners, and help us provide better content in the future. Guys, we have a website full of resources. We have a blog on the website. We have YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all linked up at habitatpodcast.com. Our land plan services, merchandise, decals, hats, t-shirts, and I give away a free 5-inch decal to anyone who leaves us a review on Apple iTunes. Really appreciate it. I want to thank our partners, Downburst Cedars, Vitalized Seed Company, Morse Nursery, Packer Max Cultipackers, Stealth Outdoors, First Light Latitude Outdoors, United Country Midwest Lifestyle Properties, and Exodus Outdoor Gear. Thanks again, guys. We'll be back next week with another great episode of the Habitat Podcast. Thanks for tuning in.